Hey everybody, and welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah, always exciting.
Today we're diving into the world of brain injuries with Dr. Louise Blackmore's Brain Book.
It's a fascinating read, and I think it's really going to help us all understand what happens to the brain after it's been injured.
I agree. One of the things that I found so interesting right off the bat was just how much our brains do for us every single day.
It really is incredible, isn't it? We take for granted things like breathing or feeling pain or even just remembering where we put our keys.
Right. And it's all thanks to this 1.5 bag of sugar, as Dr. Blackmore puts it, that we're carrying around in our heads.
That's one way to put it, and a pretty accurate one at that. But here's the thing. That bag of sugar is actually divided into two distinct halves, right? The hemispheres. Right, and each half controls the opposite side of the body, which is kind of wild when you think about it. Like, how does that even work?
Yeah, it's like a crossover connection.
Yeah.
So think about it this way. If someone experiences damage to the right side of their brain, say from a stroke, it's the left side of their body that might experience weakness or even paralysis.
Wow, it really is all connected. And speaking of connections, Dr. Blackmore points out that head injuries, statistically, are much more common in men, like a surprising 90%.
That is surprising.
Yeah.
But when it comes to other types of brain injuries, like strokes, it seems to even out impacting both men and women equally.
Makes you wonder what's going on there, right? Like, why is there such a difference?
Definitely something to ponder. But I think the key takeaway here is that brain injuries, regardless of the cause, can really manifest in a variety of ways. It all depends on the type of injury and the specific area of the brain that's affected.
So it's not like a one-size-fits-all kind of thing.
Exactly. Think of it like your smartphone, right? You've got different apps for different tasks. If you delete your social media app, it's not going to affect your ability to make calls, right?
Right. So an injury to the part of the brain responsible for language wouldn't necessarily affect motor skills. It's like separate apps just in your head.
Exactly. And Dr. Blackmore goes through the most common types of brain injuries. Head injuries from falls or accidents, strokes, which happen when there's a blockage of blood flow to the brain, encephalitis, which is like an infection, and even something called anoxic brain injury, where the brain is deprived of oxygen, like what can happen during a near-drowning experience.
Wow, so many different ways that the brain can be injured.
And each one can have a unique impact on a person's life.
It's kind of like those apps can get glitchy after the phone takes a tumble, right? They're still there, but they just don't work quite the same way.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. And Dr. Blackmore really dives into some of those challenges that people face after a brain injury. And it can be, well, it can be pretty overwhelming.
I can imagine. And for their loved ones too, right? Trying to understand what they're going through.
Absolutely. It's definitely a journey for everyone involved. One of the things that Dr. Blackmore talks about is how unpredictable the effects of a brain injury can be. She actually compares it to driving through fog.
Driving through fog.
Yeah, like some days are clearer than others, and you never know when that fog is going to roll in and make it hard to see where you're going.
That's a really good way to put it because it's not always obvious to the outside world what someone is struggling with.
Exactly. And one of the most common and often invisible challenges is fatigue.
And we're not just talking about needing an extra cup of coffee kind of fatigue, are we?
No, not at all. Dr. Blackmore really emphasizes that this is a much deeper, more pervasive fatigue that can impact every aspect of a person's life.
So it's like, even if you get a good night's sleep, you still wake up feeling exhausted.
Right. And that exhaustion makes it so much harder to do everyday things. Imagine trying to focus on a task, remember an appointment, or even just hold a conversation when your brain feels completely drained.
Oh, I totally get that. Even without a brain injury, some days my brain just feels fried and I can barely function.
Right. It's like trying to run a marathon after pulling an all-nighter. Your body and mind are just completely spent.
And Dr. Blackmore says this fatigue can actually contribute to something called slower thinking speed.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that slower thinking speed doesn't mean someone is less intelligent. It's more about how the brain processes information after an injury.
So going back to that map analogy we talked about earlier, it's like some of the routes are blocked or under construction, right?
Exactly. You can still get to your destination, but it takes longer, requires more effort, and you might need to take a few detours along the way.
So it's not that they can't think as clearly, it's that it just takes more time and energy to process everything.
Exactly. And that can be incredibly frustrating for the person experiencing it, especially in situations where they're used to thinking quickly. Like in a fast-paced conversation or a work meeting, it can be really isolating.
And if you're already feeling fatigued on top of that, it's like, how do you even begin to keep up?
It's tough. And it's understandable why someone might start to withdraw from social situations or avoid activities they used to enjoy.
It's like they're grieving the loss of their old selves, the way they used to be.
Exactly. Dr. Blackmore actually compares it to the stages of grief because there's this real sense of loss. Loss of abilities, loss of independence, even a loss of identity.
And with grief comes a whole range of emotions, right? Sadness, anger, frustration, even guilt.
All of those feelings are completely normal and valid. Dr. Blackmore emphasizes the importance of acknowledging those feelings and finding healthy ways to process them.
It's not about pretending everything is okay, but rather about giving yourself permission to feel those emotions and work through them. And it helps to have support, right?
Absolutely. Whether it's from friends and family, a therapist, or a support group, having a safe space to share those feelings and work through those challenges can make a world of difference.
And, speaking of processing those emotions and dealing with all of those changes, there's this really interesting concept that Dr. Blackmore talks about in the book. She calls it the stress test tube.
Oh yeah, that's a good one.
I thought it was such a helpful way to visualize how our capacity for stress can be affected after a brain injury.
It makes sense, right? Like after everything your brain goes through, it's like you've got less room for the everyday stresses.
Exactly. So imagine a test tube, and that represents your capacity to handle stress on any given day, right?
Mhm.
Each stressful event, like a work deadline or a traffic jam, it adds a little drop to the tube.
And just like in a real test tube, eventually it gets full and then it overflows.
Right, and with a brain injury, it's like that test tube shrinks so it fills up faster.
Yeah. Exactly. The same amount of stress that you might have handled before the injury can now feel completely overwhelming.
Like having a smaller gas tank after an accident. You can't drive as far without needing to refuel, right?
Exactly. And so someone recovering from a brain injury might find themselves getting overwhelmed more easily, even by things that wouldn't have bothered them before.
It's not that they're being difficult or overreacting, it's just that their capacity for stress has changed.
Exactly. And that's why Dr. Blackmore emphasizes the importance of, really focusing on self-care and stress management during the recovery process.
So finding healthy ways to manage that stress and create more space in that test tube.
Exactly. Things like meditation, mindfulness, spending time in nature, even just taking some time for yourself to relax and recharge, those can all make a huge difference.
Those are all good tips for everyone, really, but especially for someone who's recovering from a brain injury.
Absolutely. And another big part of that recovery process is learning how to adapt to some of those cognitive challenges we talked about earlier, like the slower thinking speed or the difficulty concentrating.
Right, because those things can make everyday tasks feel so much more daunting.
Yeah, and Dr. Blackmore actually has a whole chapter in the book dedicated to this idea of getting started, which I found so fascinating.
Getting started, tell me more.
Well, you know how sometimes you just hit a wall and you can't seem to get started on anything? Like you've got a million things to do, but you just sit there staring at your to-do
Oh
list.
my gosh, yes, all the time.
It's like that, but magnified after a brain injury. And Dr. Blackmore explains that it's often related to damage in the frontal lobe, which is responsible for what we call executive function.
So all those things like planning, organizing, initiating tasks, it's all controlled by the frontal lobe.
Exactly. It's like the air traffic control tower of your brain.
And if the air traffic control tower is malfunctioning, then nothing can take off or land properly.
Exactly. So even if someone has the desire and the ability to do something, if their frontal lobe is impaired, they might really struggle to get started.
That makes so much sense. It's not about laziness or a lack of motivation. It's a neurological issue.
Absolutely. And what's great is that Dr. Blackmore provides a really helpful 6-step process for breaking down goals into more manageable steps, which can be a game changer for someone who's struggling with this.
So instead of focusing on the overwhelming task of cleaning the entire house, you might start with something smaller like load the dishwasher.
Exactly. Or make the bed. It's about setting yourself up for success by creating smaller, more achievable goals.
Because those small victories can really add up and give you the motivation to keep going.
Exactly. And I think that's a great takeaway from this whole deep dive, right? Patience, self-compassion, and celebrating those small victories along the way. Those are all so important, not just for recovering from a brain injury, but for navigating any kind of challenge in life, really.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah, it's been a really insightful journey exploring the world of brain injuries with you all today, and I really encourage everyone to check out Dr. Blackmore's Brain Book if you're interested in learning more. It's packed with even more fascinating insights and practical advice.
Absolutely. And on that note, it's time for us to wrap up this deep dive. We hope you've gained a deeper understanding of the complexities of the brain after injury and the incredible resilience of the human spirit. Remember, even if you haven't personally experienced a brain injury, many of these insights can be applied to our own lives. We all experience stress, fatigue, and those moments of feeling overwhelmed. So, as you go about your day, maybe take a moment to check in with your own stress test tube. What helps you release some of that pressure and create more space for the good stuff? Until next time, keep those brains engaged and those hearts open.